A cruel form of torture. Nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners released as part of a ceasefire deal describe what they went through in Israeli jails. With many of their loved ones killed and homes destroyed, what will their fragile freedom look like under occupation? And what does the future hold for those forced into exile? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Now, thousands of Palestinian prisoners, most of them detained without charge, have been released from Israeli jails as part of the Gaza ceasefire deal. Reunions, though, saw a mix of joy and sadness after people heard about the conditions their loved ones endured. Electroshock devices, physical and sexual abuse, starvation, outbreaks of disease, and several high-profile prisoners, including Marwan Barghouti, remain in Israeli jails. Hundreds more were forced into exile by Israel. The majority, though, they return to rubble in Gaza and risk being arrested again in the occupied West Bank. So is it possible for former Palestinian prisoners to truly embrace freedom with life under occupation and the scars of Israeli detention? We'll put that to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Alexandra Byers.
Shadi Abu Said has just spent the last 2 years in an Israeli prison, being told by Israeli forces that they had killed his wife and his children in Gaza. This is the moment he realized that was a lie. Shadi was one of nearly 2,000 Palestinians released by Israel this week as part of the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire. Most were held under Israel's so-called administrative detention, with no charges, no trial, held indefinitely. And they say they've suffered unprecedented levels of torture and abuse.
I went hungry for the past 2 years. I swear to God, they didn't feed us. They kept us naked. They beat us while we were naked. Day and night we were tortured. Till our last day in Israeli prison, they cut us and hit us and abused us. We endured every kind of torture, emotional and physical. We couldn't even sleep. They threatened us with our children. They told me they killed my children. They told us that Gaza was destroyed. I arrived here and found that everything was gone. It looked like the end of the world. Everything is different.
Surrounded by destruction, there was joy in southern Gaza as the buses arrived and families were reunited. But there were also many scenes of unbearable loss. This man gained his freedom only to discover his family was gone, killed by an Israeli airstrike. There were also tearful reunions in the occupied West Bank. Some of the released prisoners were serving lengthy sentences and hadn't seen their families for decades.
It's like coming from hell to heaven. It's a mixture of feelings that I can't describe. Pain, joy, and strange feelings.
When the war on Gaza began, Israeli forces intensified raids across the occupied Palestinian territory, with at least 20,000 arrests documented in the occupied West Bank alone, the number from Gaza unknown. In these 2 years, at least 78 Palestinians were declared dead in Israeli custody. Palestinians say the real number is higher and is caused by deliberate starvation and lack of medical attention. For the families and loved ones, the waiting and the unknown has been too much. The family of Mohammed Imran only learned at the last minute that instead of returning home, he was among the 154 freed prisoners being forced into exile.
I looked at each and every released prisoner coming out of the bus, but I couldn't find him.
Despite those freed in the latest deal, many others continue to suffer. Popular Palestinian leader Marwan Barghouti and Hussam Abu Safiya, a hospital director from Gaza, are among more than 9,000 Palestinians still imprisoned by Israel. At least 450 are under the age of 18. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring our guests into the show. They're joining us all from the occupied West Bank. Milena Ansari is the Israel and Palestine researcher at Human Rights Watch and trained in international law. Bassel Faraj is an assistant professor at Birzeit University, focusing on political prisoners and abuse in prisons. And Marwan Barghouti is an English supervisor at the Palestinian Ministry of Education. She and her husband and son are all former detainees. A warm welcome to you all. If I could start with Milena. You know, Milena, when we use the term Palestinian prisoner, it implies that Palestinians have gone through a certain process, right? That there were legal grounds for their arrest, that they were all charged, that they went through some kind of trial and sentenced. How much of that applies to the majority of Palestinian detainees?
Thank you. That's a really important question to start with. You know, when we talk about prisoners and detainees, the presumption is that they've been through a legal process of some sort. But the reality for Palestinians living in the occupied territory under a military rule, an Israeli military rule, entails that they are prosecuted and held accountable before an Israeli military court, which neglects any fair trial guarantees. And these military courts and the military orders that basically criminalize every aspect of a Palestinian daily life is part and parcel of Israel's, discrimination in detention and imprisonment.
Milena, just clarify for us what is the difference in the procedure of a military court compared to what maybe viewers might be familiar with around the world in terms of normal legal process?
Yeah, like if we take just on the part of administrative detention, which is a process where Israeli forces detain a person without charge or trial, and it can be renewed indefinitely based on secret information, which neither the detainee nor the lawyer themselves are allowed to see. And administrative detainees are held under the presumption that they might in the future commit some kind of an offense at some point. And Israeli authorities hold children, human rights defenders, Palestinian political activists, and many other under administrative detention. To be clear, administrative detention is not illegal under international humanitarian law as a temporary and exceptional measure. However, Israel's sweeping use of administrative detention on the whole Palestinian population more than half a century into the occupation without an end sight far exceeds what the law authorizes. And these military courts that I was mentioning are part of Israel's systematic oppression of Palestinians, where it's part of the apartheid and persecution as crimes against humanity that Israel
Milena,
implements on Palestinians.
I do want to talk about that and what these administrative detentions represent in terms of the overall picture. But before we go down that route, I want to focus and bring in Bassel into a point which you also mentioned. Bassel, the fact that administrative detention has no time limit, right? And combined with this sort of concept of preventative detention, that we can detain someone before they've actually committed any crime on the accusation or the suspicion or the allegation that this person will or might commit something. When you put those two together, that creates a very difficult situation for Palestinian communities, right?
Of course, I think it's the idea that there is, so to understand this, we also have to say that, at the core of this is conceptualizing or viewing the Palestinian as a continuous potential threat. So that sense of, a Palestinian kind of offering or presenting a threat to the quote-unquote security of the state justifies any measures, including, for instance, administrative detention or unlawful combatant law, which similarly allows the Israeli carceral regime to detain Palestinians and Arabs from other nationalities without subjecting them to charge or trial. So, of course, it is that looming threat itself, in my understanding and in the experience of Palestinian prisoners, is another instance of torture that this carceral regime inflicts upon Palestinian prisoners. The fact that you might be arrested, as Milena had said a second ago, by the discretion of of an Israeli officer who would, mention that, this particular Palestinian might represent a threat to the security of the state is by itself, an attestment to the way in which this carceral regime functions. It places Palestinians in that constant kind of state of anticipating a potential arrest, of anticipating violence. And I think it's through these kind of policies, administrative detention, unlawful combatant law, or in fact, the whole structure of the architecture of the Israeli military courts, we might begin to understand how Israel has historically relied on carcerality as one of its central tactics to break the Palestinian population and to kind of influence Palestinians.
And Bassel, just to clarify, these administrative detention orders are regularly renewed, right? And they can go on
definitely.
without limit being renewed.
Yes. I mean, it's arbitrarily, it's prolonged captivity. I mean, many of the prisoners we just witnessed now released from the Gaza Strip are Palestinian detainees who have been held under similar law that allows the Israeli military courts and Israeli court system to detain Palestinians for prolonged periods. And you can imagine, the pain and the torture of having to wait, not knowing not only when you might be released, but in fact why you have been arrested. And I think Israel functions on this kind of uncertainty. It functions to instill that sense of fear. And I think that's why Palestinians always mention, the small and the large prison. So in a sense, the prison itself had become a metaphor to the way in which Israel enforces its kind of control over time and space on the Palestinian population.
All right, let's take it to Fadia now. Fadia, you were actually held by the Israelis. Why? What were you charged with, if you were charged with anything?
I was detained in February, and I think the main reason was because of participating in demonstrations with the family of Palestinian detainees, asking for the freedom of my husband, the freedom of my son, and also asking for better conditions for Palestinian detainees who were suffering.
Hang on, Fadia, because you've said a lot of things that have really raised my curiosity. First of all, you said you think the reason was because you participated in protests. Does that mean you were never? Why did you say you think? Were you ever formally charged with any offence?
I was arrested under something called administrative detention, where the prisoner, his lawyer, have no reason why this detainee is being under detention. The only thing that you hear that you are a threat and your freedom threatens their security. So they ask for your imprisonment. And when they interrogated me, one of the charge that you have, let's say, made the streets move, or let's say participating in street movement and activities. The only thing that I participated in that time was activities asking for the freedom of my family members.
Okay, so I'm still curious. Hang on, Fadia. So you were never formally charged, and you understood from the interrogation that probably the reason was because you'd participated in protests. If you were never given the charge, could you defend against anything? If you or your lawyers were never formally told or given a reason, how long were you kept? And was there any possibility for your lawyers to challenge your detention then?
Yeah, I stayed for 3 months. Meanwhile, my husband stayed for 2 years under administrative detention. My husband spent 7 years under administrative detention. So when we're talking about administrative detention, the only thing they say that they have a secret file. No one can see this file but the judge. So even my lawyer was unable to see the file or knew the evidences or even defend me. The only thing that he asked for is asking for his client's freedom.
Milena, how normal is that? Is this an extreme case? I think she mentioned her son in administrative detention. Was it your son for 7 years and the husband for 3 years? That sounds like a long period of time.
Yeah, this is exactly what we mean that, the way Israeli authorities use administrative detention far exceeds what the law actually permits. We've had cases where, not only older people, but children, where you cannot even argue. I myself as a lawyer, you stand in a military court completely helpless. Like, how do you argue against something you have no idea what it is? And most of the Palestinian lawyers, what they do is they try to focus on the humanitarian aspect of a story. I recall a child, Amal Nakhle, who even had a medical condition and was arrested under administrative detention with his order renewed over and over again without providing any additional evidence. So, as lawyers, we were pleading to a military judge who is basically an Israeli soldier, pleading to look at the case of a child. When a child should be held as a last resort, you see Israeli authorities holding more than 170 children in administrative detention. So lawyers just only have the ability to plead for the humanity in a case.
Milena, when you say a child, what ages are we talking about? How old was Amal al-Nakhle?
Amal al-Nakhle was 17 years old, and a child is any person under 18 years old. There's no for Human Rights Watch. International law is very clear. A child is anyone who is under 18 years old. So if someone is 17 and a half or 18, this still considers a child. But what I wanted to make a point, and this is really important, the conviction rate in Israeli military courts is 99.9%. And this is according to Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem. So the system is basically built to keep Palestinians inside detention. The whole principle of, innocent until proven guilty. This doesn't exist in any military court procedure.
Okay. I want to pick up on that point. More than 99% conviction rate, Bassel. Is this basically seen as a tool of preserving occupation, a method of breaking any Palestinian will or desire or notion to try and challenge the occupation or resist it?
Yes, I think, the figures that we just heard now attest to the centrality of the carceral regime as a central tactic of controlling the Palestinian population. But of course, we have to remember here that it's, of course, a colonial tactic. So if we look at resistance against colonialism, we always notice the ways in which prisons and sites of captivity were used to crush any form of resistance, any form of social and political existence in a way. And I think these kind of high conviction rates that Israel adheres to, in fact, perhaps one of the highest conviction rates in the world, and actually they're absurd numbers if we think about it, 99%. What that means, actually, Palestinians themselves know if you are standing in front of an Israeli judge, you would never attain justice. These judges, in fact, the whole entire kind of military court itself is a representation of Israel's colonial system. The judges are soldiers. The translators are soldiers themselves. So in a way, this entire regime is built upon, as you have mentioned now, to not only crush down any kind of aspiration for freedom, for justice. But I think there's something more violent here. It's to tell Palestinians that you're always being surveilled, that there is, this potential, arrest is always looming. So you have to be.
So there's a proverbial sword always hanging over the head of Palestinians. Let me take it to Milena and ask you. It sounds like this is perhaps what human rights groups like Amnesty International were talking about when they referred to administrative detention as one of the tools to enforce a system of apartheid against Palestinians. Explain to us how that works, a sort of different treatment. Even if you're in the occupied territories, if you are an Israeli settler, you have a very different experience of a legal process than if you are an occupied Palestinian, right?
Definitely, and this is for Palestinians living under occupation, whether the West Bank, including Jerusalem, or even the Gaza Strip, there's a separate criminal, let me say, justice system that Israeli authorities maintain in the occupied territory. And as you mentioned, an Israeli settler illegally residing in the occupied West Bank is not tried in the same military court or court that Palestinians are tried in. And this entails, different laws, different due process rights, and they face sentences that are also exaggerated and things that are criminalized that shouldn't be. Let me, really important, give you examples of these. Israeli military orders that criminalize, I said this before, every aspect of a Palestinian life. I mean every aspect of a Palestinian life. Attending a protest in the occupied territory can get someone charged and imprisoned. Even, students, Fadia mentioned really important note about students. Israeli military courts basically criminalize all student groups at Birzeit University. So any student affiliated to a student group, part of the student council, and the normal cultural and civil and political rights for a Palestinian student in their own university could be held, could be arrested, tried, and prosecuted. Only, for example, there was a case of a female student who, danced dabke, the Palestinian folklore dance, as part of a student group in Birzeit University, and she was detained for 11 months under a list of charges. It's also parliamentarians like Khalida Jarrar, who's repeatedly arrested solely for her parliamentarian role and political activism.
Right, so it's all encompassing on Palestinian life. I want to move the discussion along to now the treatment that Palestinians experience in jails. On February the 19th of 2024, we had a statement by 7 UN experts referencing the sexual assault of Palestinian women and girls. In 2 cases, they said reportedly raped. They talked about things like having inappropriate pictures of them, photos of the female detainees, taken and uploaded online. Even Palestinian women and girls reportedly arbitrarily executed. Just talk to us, Basil, about how common do you hear of abuse of Palestinian detainees in Israeli custody?
Yes, so Sami, this is not only common, it's systematic. Of course, since genocide began shortly over 2 years ago, we've heard of the intensification of these forms of violence, torture, sexual assault, of course, the infamous torture methods that were used in Zeidan, for instance. And as horrific as these conditions were, as horrific as these torture practices were, we've also witnessed, of course, through the kind of, when the prisoners were released, we witnessed kind of the physical effect of this torture and violence. But we have to recall something here, that Israel's carceral regime functions through torture and violence. It systematically practiced these torture methods, these violent and extremely violent methods. In fact, not only practices them, but had found ways of legalizing these torture practices. For instance, just to mention very quickly, the 1999 High Court of Justice ruling that supposedly bans torture while actually allowing it in so-called ticking bomb scenario, or kind of, for the protection of the state and its security. So I have to here just emphasize that the carceral regime functions through this kind of violent and torture practices. It's not only common, it's systematic. Israel has systematically practiced these torture practices that actually have led to the death, to the killing, the intentional killing of at least 78 Palestinians inside Israeli prisons over the past 2 years alone. This adds to over 300 Palestinians who were killed in Israeli prisons.
Milena, Israel would say they are a state of law and order, that if excesses occur, they investigate. In your experience, is there redress for people who've experienced abuse? Again, referring to this statement by 7 UN experts, they report quite unusual things, like that Palestinian women detained in Gaza, kept in a cage in the rain and cold without food. Now, assuming they come out, can they come to organizations, to lawyers like you, and seek some redress for that?
I'll answer this as wide as clear. If we're looking for, accountability or justice in Israeli courts, we will never find that. Based on an Israeli human rights organization, Yesh Din, hundreds of complaints were filed against Israeli soldiers and prison guards for torture and abuse between 2017 and 2020. Only 0.02% of complaints were actually opened without, a proper investigation or conclusion. So no, really, there's a system of impunity that the Israeli society, including mainly Israeli officials, provide prison guards and Israeli forces to take on torture and ill treatment without feeling responsible. When you have people like the minister Ben Gvir, the most racist, extremist Israeli minister in charge of Israel national security and in charge of prison conditions and what happens inside prisons and detention facilities, you can only understand the impunity that is given to Israeli soldiers and prison guards.
I think we've got, Milena, we've got about a minute left, if you don't mind. Sorry, but I want to give it to Fadia. A final thought, a family that you were all at different times in prison. Now you're out. How easy is it for you to really put the family back together? What does the future look like in your eyes?
The most important thing that after being released, we are not in ease. They keep on coming to our house, threatening us, destroying the house, beating us. Sometimes they arrest my husband for hours, torture him, then return him back. And they keep on telling us, everyone who participated activities before the 7th of October will pay the price for the rest of his life.
Fadia, thank you for sharing your story with us. I think it's time, unfortunately, for us to thank the guests and leave it at here. Milena Ansari, Basil Faraj and Fadia Barghouti. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the entire team here for now, it's goodbye.